Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're here with ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones to talk about ways to frame your job search story. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, that's me, and normally I'm here with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're here with ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones to talk about how to frame your job search story. So welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
Our pleasure. So some people might be listening to this and thinking, job search story? What are they even talking about? I don't have a story, but we all have a story. And the important thing here is your story needs to make sense in the context you're applying for, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's something that students don't think about a lot, what their materials say to the employer, because I think that they need to make sense for the job you're applying for and make sense for your background. And I think that it's a good way to kind of look at your materials and go over it to see it from their point of view.
Right, because your materials are telling a story. It just might not be the one that you want to be telling for this particular job. So, for a lot of people, this is going to depend on the job you're applying for. For example, my law school roommate was interested in starting a public interest career, but her previous background had been in things like computer programming, and I think she worked for like a bank at some point. So she had to think about, how do I shape this? Because her real personality was much more public interest, and that was actually what she wanted to do. It was totally legit. But she had to think about how to frame all of this so that when you looked at her resume, you weren't just like, wait, what's this girl who was in IT at a bank telling me that she wants to do this public interest job? This doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. And I think it can go the other way around. Like you're applying for BigLaw, but you have only public interest on your resume.
Yep.
So they think, well, why would you want to work here? You're just going to leave. So I think that it's not really about necessarily taking things out or adding things, although sometimes it is. It's more emphasizing things and making sure that it makes sense for what you're applying for.
Yeah, absolutely. Because my roommate was the year below me. And so I'd had some friends go through a similar thing trying to get public interest funding, and they got rejected. And so, I kind of told her the story and was like, look, you need to really be sure that your resume says public interest, even if that's not what you spend the majority of your time doing, because otherwise you're not going to be successful getting funding. And then she completely changed her resume and did get funding, but she had to emphasize different things.
Exactly. And I think that a lot of people do not like to write cover letters. They avoid them at all costs. And it really is your chance to explain it even more than what your resume says. So I think, that's another opportunity that people sort of miss.
I think that's right. Some people think the cover letter is just completely formulaic. I can just pull a template from the internet and drop in my name. And it's that's not, that's a missed opportunity.
Exactly.
Because some people, depending on who's reading this, some people might start with your resume and some people might start with your cover letter. So for example, when we do hiring, we ask people to submit a form with a few questions and answers and a resume. And I'll tell you, I always read their form first, and my business partner always reads the resume. So you don't know what you're going to get.
Yeah, so I think you need to kind of look at things separately and then also together. So you kind of get the big picture, and then you also are making sure that each individual thing is telling the right story. But everything is an opportunity here. And, when you're talking to them also, it's, in the initial screen or whatever it is, it's another chance to explain anything you want to explain.
Right. So let's touch on that for a little. So how can people figure out what story they want to be telling here?
Well, first you want to look at what you're applying for, because it should all be specific to that. So you may be only applying to certain jobs, in which case you can kind of just look at the general story you're telling. If all the jobs you're applying for are public interest, then you know that that's what you want to do. Maybe you're applying for some public interest and you're applying for some law firm jobs, in which case maybe you want to have 2 different resumes,
I think definitely.
cover letters.
Yeah, for sure.
So, there are people who know exactly what direction they want to go, and there's other people who are kind of keeping their options open. So I think what you want to start with is, what's the job I'm applying for? What are they going to want to look for in me? And how can I come across as the best candidate for this job with the, experience I have? Because it needs to all be true.
Right, exactly. You're not allowed to
We're
make things up.
We're not telling anyone to make things up. Exactly. That's the worst thing you can do. So never do that.
Yeah, you
but
can
really
emphasize
it's marketing.
But
yeah, you're selling yourself.
My sister, when I was helping her apply to graduate school, her summer where she was basically following fish. Sorry if anyone at Columbia is listening to this, but she was following fish around the country, and that became tour of the national parks and monuments of America, which was not untrue. They did go to a lot of them.
Well, I think, that there's a best light, putting it in the best light. There's always a way to phrase things or, kind of say it in a certain way and keep it true, but also make sure that it's relevant.
Right. I think you need to be able to talk about it too in a way that makes sense. So, and one small note, if you do have multiple versions of your resume, you want to be careful about what you name them. Because you don't want the person who's getting this resume thinking, oh, teaching resume. Well, what else are they applying for?
Yeah. It should be a name that just sounds like it goes with, the job you're applying for. So
yeah. And you can have whatever you want on your computer, but when you do your final PDF version to send off, it probably should just be Alison Monahan resume, nothing more than that, because you don't want to raise suspicions about like public interest resume when you're sending it to a firm or something.
And make sure that you keep them straight though for yourself, so that you're sending the right resume to the right place.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess sometimes people aren't sure kind of like how to find out what the job might be looking for. So, I think the things you're looking for here, some of them are obvious. What skills are they asking you for? What experience are they asking you for? Obviously, this stuff matters, but it's also kind of a bigger picture that you have to kind of take a step back and think about, what kind of character traits are they looking for here? Mm-hmm. What type of life experiences might they be looking for? So, if you are applying for a certain type of public interest role and you have had personal life experience in that area, say it's something about, working with people who are homeless or something like that, and you happen to be homeless, or, an adoptee and you were adopted or foster child or whatever, then all these things really come into part of your story too, right?
Absolutely. And I think the reverse of that is also true, which is that I do sometimes find that with, kind of jobs that are like at a for-profit place, like a law firm, that people will emphasize like all their volunteer work and all this other stuff. And I always say, like, let's just take that off. Because especially, if there's room for it, fine. And you can have some of that. But what you want to say is that, they're looking more at the academic side. They're looking at that you want to work for a place, where the objective is that they're a business that wants to make money. And that you understand that, that you've worked hard at things. And I think that people sometimes, don't think about that when they're putting it together.
I think that's absolutely right. And this is one of those cases where, we often have mentioned that probably not the greatest interview question at a law firm, particularly not in the first rounds, is, well, how much pro bono work do you do? Or tell me about your pro bono program. Because obviously they might like to talk about that, but it also plants the seed, particularly if your resume is pointing towards you were in the Peace Corps and all of your jobs have been public interest type jobs. They're thinking, does this person really just want to come here and like somehow think that they're going to do pro bono work all the time?
Or also, I think the other thing that probably all of these jobs are looking for is that you want to do this job and stay there. And whether or not that's true, I don't know if that's relevant right now, but you need to try to make the case that you do. And so that's what your resume, your cover letter should say. And if they ask you, that's what you should say. I don't think it's a great idea. I want to work here for a couple of years and pay off some student loans.
Get some experience and then go somewhere else with that experience.
Exactly.
I mean, even if people know that's what's likely to happen, they don't want to hear it.
And that's where, the city can come into play too. So, you want to make it clear that that's where you want to be. And so I think we've talked about this before, but if it's somewhere where you don't have a strong connection, you need to try to play up whatever you do have and make it very clear that you are sure this is where you want to be.
Yeah, that's one of those where if you are pretty sure you want to work in a city you've never worked in before, 2 years down the road, you probably want to start making some ties to that area, maybe your first summer of law school, so that it then is a story that makes sense of, you're right, like I hadn't really lived here before, but I'd always wanted to. And then my first summer, I got a job here and I really enjoyed it. And I made some connections in the legal community and I really liked it. And so now I want to come back and work here again. That's a story that people will buy.
Absolutely. And I tell people that, for the 1L summer, that's something you really should think about because your options in a way are more open. And, since you're not looking for, that crucial 2L job and you just need something, you can kind of work in another city and make that happen. So I think that's something to kind of consider earlier rather than later if it's somewhere that you don't have a connection to.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right because it's all part of your story. And people, when we say story, really we're looking for credibility. You need to be able to make a credible case that this is something you're actually legitimately interested in doing for at least the semi-long term. And of course, no one expects you to make life decisions that are completely binding, but you need to have some idea what you're talking about.
And I think that they also kind of want to see what's your trajectory. Mm-hmm. And so you could have done different things and it's not, a linear path. But I do think that telling the story is saying this is what got me from here to there to there.
Right.
And I think especially for people where law school doesn't seem like the obvious next step for you, you should be able, though, to tell a story where it makes sense. Why did you go?
Yeah, because I think you are always the one who needs to be ready to overcome these potential obstacles or objections to your candidacy. So, for example, for me, I had a really weird background. I went from sociology to a master's in architecture, and then I worked as a programmer, and then I went to law school. So you can imagine when I'm interviewing for jobs, people, they see my resume, and they just kind of get this look. And they kind of look at the resume, and then they look at me, and they look back at the resume, and they look back at me, and they go, sociology to architecture to programming to law. Tell me about that, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And they're not necessarily, it's not disqualifying. It's really more of just puzzlement of this seems like a strange path to be on. Explain this to me. So I had to be ready to tell them, designing a database is basically the same thing as designing a house, is the same thing as designing a brief, and all of these skills that I learned in this sort of weird path, they actually all will come together and making me this amazing employee that you would love to hire. And they're kind of okay, that's interesting. I get that. And then they move on.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point too, which is that it sounds like you are confident in your story and you're confident in what you've done and how you've gotten here. I think there are people sometimes where they do have things that seem off base and they're sort of trying to hide them or downplay them or, not have a reason why it makes sense. And I think you should feel like you're proud of your background and the things you've done. Whether or not it all did make sense at the time, you can always go back and figure it out.
Right.
How you're going to explain it. But I think you should feel like you can explain to someone why this was good experience and how this is going to help me. Because I think so many different skills can help you as a lawyer or, whatever job you're applying for. And you just need to figure out what the things are that you're going to emphasize in those or, other degree that you've had or anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, everybody has something that's probably less favorable in their background or on their resume, whether it's, people, there are lots of things people could get defensive about, whether it's you have too much experience, so you feel like you're going to be rejected for that, on those grounds, or maybe you're coming straight from undergrad, so you feel like you don't have enough experience and you get defensive about that. There's no need to get defensive about any of this. You just need to think about how you're going to respond if somebody starts to ask about this or push on this. You know, if you're coming straight from undergrad and you're doing an interview with some crusty partner who's like, well, I mean, it doesn't look like you really have any work experience to talk, you know, speak of, got this one internship. You know, you need to have a response to that, which is, well, you know, I did this and I did this and I did this and I had leadership positions here. And these are the ways that I'm developing these skills. I'm doing pro bono work or whatever. Honestly, they don't really care. They just want to hear something.
Yeah, I think it's definitely more about your answer than what the facts are. It's like, how are you handling this?
Right.
I also think with a story, there's sort of two aspects, which is one, you want your materials to tell a story so that they want to at least bring you in, you know, or pick you or whatever the first round is. And then, you know, if you get past that, I think you also need to be able to explain it more in depth. And, you know, there might be other questions.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, in terms of the things that you can use to kind of shape this story and the things that you are really in control of, obviously your resume, your cover letter, you can put whatever you like on them as long as it's true, or basically true. But I think even the jobs that you decide to apply for, you know, that can shape the story that you're telling because you're deciding that, okay, this particular job is interesting to me. Well, why is it interesting to you? I mean, maybe it's just, well, it pays a lot. Okay, that's probably not the greatest reason, but, you know, hopefully there's something else about the role that you think, oh, yeah, like I could do this. I want to do this. So that can be part of your story as well. And that's really the kind of things that come up in your interview, you know, where you need to have thought through, like, why is this a good fit for me?
And I do think that it comes across when you're passionate about something or it's obvious that that's what you want to do. I think that employers see that. Yeah. And I think that that's something that it's an opportunity to do that. And sometimes you're applying for things, right, where it wasn't your first choice.
But it better be a choice.
Yeah, exactly. I think it can be harder, but I think whether or not it was your first choice, you need to go into it like it was. Like you need to, you know, muster some excitement and make it all make sense. And really what you're doing is just picking, I think, the skills and experience that you want to emphasize that go with what that was. So that's why we're saying you're not lying about anything or misleading people. You're just focusing on one thing over another thing.
Right. So, I mean, you can find these pieces in a lot of different places. And sometimes people think like, oh, it's just a job that I had, or maybe just, you know, the degree that I did, but it's really a lot beyond that. So what kind of other things can people talk about?
Well, you can talk about experiences outside of the legal world or law school. So just things you're generally interested in or like we were talking about volunteer work sometimes, things that you've actually like given your time and effort to. Cause some of those things are going to be directly relevant to the jobs you're looking at. Yeah. Travel, you know, other like personal life experiences that you've had, things like that.
Yeah, I think even, you know, you can go beyond just the degree in education and list out like specific classes that you've taken that maybe are relevant, or if you did like a major paper as an undergraduate that was relevant, or probably really anything that you did a major paper, whether it was relevant or not, should probably be on there. Because part of what you're doing, you know, you're not selling just, oh, I have the exact experience. You're selling, oh, I can, you know, I'm a person who can execute a large research project. So even if the paper that you wrote wasn't directly related to law, it's still something people might want to know about.
Absolutely. But I will say on that, like you said, it should be like a major, you know, paper
like an honors thesis or something.
But I do find some people, if they feel that they don't have a lot, they put a ton of undergrad like classes that they've taken, random things. And I'll say that from the employer side, you kind of look at it like just a big muck of like, what is this?
Right, because they're not telling their story.
Writing everything down. Yeah, exactly. So I think it can get kind of, you know, confusing in there. So make sure that things you're putting are important.
Right, that they're relevant, you know. Yeah. And I think you have to be careful about certain undergraduate experiences, like, you know, particularly around like fraternities and sororities and things like that. That can be, you know, a trigger for different people who might be looking at this, positive or negative. So you've got to know your audience.
Definitely. And those things are hard because I do find that different people will just react differently to them, but it may not be worth the risk. unless it's super important for some reason.
Yeah, I think if you had a leadership role, that's different. Yeah. But if you're just like, I was a member of this fraternity, it's like, okay, great, thanks. What am I supposed to do with this?
Some people are going to ding you for that. Yeah, it's just, and maybe that's not fair, but they will.
Right, I think it can be the same thing with like affinity groups and things in law school. Like that can be a way to signal what might be unique about your life experience. And I think that's absolutely, if it makes sense in the context of the story you're telling, is a great thing.
Absolutely.
But again, like you have to know your audience. If you're applying to super conservative judges and you're very active in student politics or something like that, you would think probably like, well, is this going to help my application? You might also think, do I actually want to work for this person? Mm-hmm. If you feel like you're hiding things from that are important to you because you don't think it's going to help you make a case that this is the right job for you, then maybe it's actually just not the right job.
Especially because if you were in that group or that club or whatever it is, it probably is something that's important to you enough that you did that.
Yeah, sometimes too you see some funny stuff like people put that they're in both the American Constitutional Society and the Federalists, and you're like, okay, you can't really be both of those.
Quite a bit. Yeah, it's very odd. And you have to then expect the question.
Right. Well, I think it's one of those where like, again, know your audience. I'm like, I don't care if you're in both clubs because you're a social climber and you just want to put them on your resume, but only put one of them on there and think about which one makes the most sense for this position.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and things like hobbies and stuff too. I mean, particularly if it's something you're serious about, like I was an Olympic athlete. It's like, oh, that might not be directly relevant to the job you're applying for, but that says something about your character. It says that you can work hard. It says you're diligent. It says a lot of things. So that's something that ideally, people are going to look at and be like, wow, that's impressive. Plus it's interesting. Somebody might want to talk to you about it.
Yeah, or even college athletics, or, if you've done something where, you had to work really hard at it, or you had a leadership position. I think that people don't even realize that the employer side really does look at those things as a positive, and it matters.
Yeah, and I think too, depending on the role. So for example, if you're applying for a role that's going to have a lot of client-facing interaction, then you want to be thinking about, well, what's in my background that would show that I'm an empathetic person who can talk to other people? Because that's not actually that common with a lot of lawyers and law students. So, there may be, volunteer positions you had and where you explain what you were doing, if you were doing one-on-one work with people, because that's the sort of skill set that somebody might be looking for in that role.
Absolutely. Or something that demonstrates your writing skills or something else. So think about what the experience is and what it shows people. I was going to say something to be careful about is languages. So let's say there's something where you think a language would be helpful. Make sure you're only putting it down if you feel comfortable enough in it that you could speak in a business setting.
Right.
Because I think that can be tricky because they could test you like right away.
Oh, I've heard many, many stories of people going into job interviews with someone who expected to speak to them exclusively in the language that they were fluent in. And it's like, well, you actually weren't really fluent.
Yeah, because I think it can be great to have a language on there, but be careful.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes people wonder what to do about jobs that maybe don't seem as prestigious. Like say, for example, you worked your way through undergrad and you had a job that was 20 or 30 hours a week, but it was something like working in the library or food service or something like that. And they wonder like, well, should I leave this off? I mean, my opinion on that is if it was something you spent that much time on, you put it on your resume and you own it and you say, yeah, like I'm proud that I worked my way through college.
Completely. I'm a big believer in that. And I think that you should try to explain in it, especially if you like put yourself through school doing it, or you worked that hard and you were, doing well in school. I think that's great. On the other hand, if you just worked a retail job during the summer,
right? Or I was a lifeguard.
Yeah,
like I did not put lifeguard on my law school job applications.
But I think some people also, especially if you went straight through, I think you're trying to find filler. People spot that and they don't really like it. There's other ways that you can kind of beef up a resume without putting that kind of thing in.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, let's move on to that point since we're getting close to time now. So now you've thought about it, you figured out like, okay, this is the story I want to tell. How can people start making sure everything's consistent? Like, what do they need to think about and look at?
Well, I think the best thing you can do is ask somebody else to look at it.
True.
Because it's really hard for you to see something you've been working on a long time. And I would have different people look at it, and I would be prepared for real feedback, and don't be defensive.
Right.
And you're going to get different feedback from different people. But I think like the best thing you can do is to have a fresh eye on it. I also think that you can kind of ask yourself, what are the basic questions you'd ask in an interview, and how does my story, answer that? And I think there's two different steps. Again, there's okay, what would they just be looking for to like bring me in? So because that you can't talk, you just have your written materials. So I think you have to say, like, what does this say to them? Like, if I were looking through, I would go step by step. Okay, it says this is where I started. This is where I went next. Will this make sense? Is there a gap in it that I'm going to have to explain in the cover letter, pretty much? If it's before you get in. And then I think there's the next step, which is, what might they ask me in an interview based on this? What do I think the holes are, the red flags are, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything needs to work together here. So your resume needs to be consistent with your cover letter. You don't want to be talking about something in your cover letter that's not on your resume. And then things that are online, I think, are also fair game that you have to be paying attention to. So number one, you need a LinkedIn profile. That LinkedIn profile needs to be consistent with what is on your resume. That can get a little tricky, if you're having multiple versions of your resume and somebody goes to LinkedIn and they find out that actually, oh, you did this other thing for like 5 years. So, you've got to think carefully about how to frame that if you're going to be dropping things off your resume. I mean, I would suggest probably don't want to do that at that point. And the other thing is you've got to Google yourself,
Absolutely.
So you need to know what's out there. And maybe there's somebody with the same name who has done things that are not favorable. You just need to be aware so that if somebody says, oh, we Googled you and found out you're a bank robber, you're like, no, actually that person is like not me.
But you know that.
And social media, to the extent it's public. I mean, it's amazing what people put on Instagram. Let me just say that.
Absolutely. And even things that aren't public, I think you should still be careful about. Because someone might know someone who's friends with you. Or like if you look on Facebook, sometimes they're always updating their privacy settings. And so sometimes you don't know which things are public or not. What's your profile picture?
Right.
I can't believe some of the things I see.
Well, or if you say something super offensive in a group and people screenshot it and send it to Above the Law, I mean, all these things happen,
Yeah. And I think it's hard, to know everything that's out there about you, but I think you can do your best to, keep it in check. And you should probably be thinking about this before you even go to law school.
Yeah, absolutely. And, something like about Instagram, that's one of those where you can just change your screen name so it's not that easy to find you. I mean, I don't think you can find me on Instagram, not because I'm hiding anything, just because I kind of was like, oh, I don't really want my real name here. And, particularly depending on what you're posting, that could be a very good idea.
I think you can also not use your main email address.
True. Yeah, because they link up everything.
Connected. Yeah, because, someone like looks at their contacts or has your email or whatever.
Yeah.
And some of it, I think it's okay if there are things you want to be outspoken about that you don't mind people seeing, and there are times where it's relevant, where being political is okay. I just think you need to know what it is and how it's out there. Like, a lot of people have their own blogs. So think about that. Think about comments that people write and how you're responding.
Well, and all of this is part of your story. So if your story is that I'm an activist and I'm posting highly political content day and night on all sorts of social media, that might be fine if that, aligns with the jobs that you're applying for. It might not be fine if you are applying for, a large law firm in a conservative city. So it's just up to you, like what you want to have out there.
Yeah. And I think you should think about also on LinkedIn, like what's your photo, because it should be professional looking.
Yes, definitely. And not having a photo on LinkedIn is really not acceptable. So just, put on a nice blazer or something and have a friend take a picture of you in front of a wall for, with your iPhone or something. Like It doesn't have to be anything
fancy.
fancy.
To get professional pictures.
No, it doesn't need to be fancy, but you do need something. I feel like whenever people ask to connect with me on LinkedIn and they don't have a photo, I just immediately assume it's spam.
Definitely.
All right. Well, before we wrap up, so what if people just don't have the story that they want to be telling? You know, maybe they're making a career transition or something. How can they start to develop the story that they want?
Yeah, and I think that's okay. Not everyone has been thinking about this their whole life.
Right. Not everyone's
exactly what their trajectory is.
The perfect law student.
Yeah, and I'm sure like when you were talking about your story that, you know, you made the story for it later, but I'm sure as you were going, you weren't like, okay, this is going to make sense.
I didn't start architecture school thinking that in 5 years I'd go to law school.
Right, because it's the same thing. So I think that, you know, part of it is kind of going backwards and figuring out what, you know, led to what. But I think what we were saying earlier about sort of planning a little bit and adding some things in. So, you know, like going to the city you want to be before, you know, you're at your 2L summer, I think is great. You know, I think it's also fine to get some experience. Let's say your 1L summer in government work or in public interest work, and still it's okay to then apply, you know, in a law firm after. Because, you know, the story is that's the job I could get 1L summer and I got great experience there, and you talk about what you did.
Right.
And it didn't mean that, you know, that was your plan all along.
Yeah.
So I think you have to think about the things you have control over that can show your interest in whatever it is. And I think there are a lot of things. There are clubs you can get involved in at school, because maybe there's a practice area you're really interested in, you know, and you can get on a journal or something like that, or in a club or whatever it is. So I think you have to think about the things you can control, and then, you know, in the end, you have to go back and look at the reality of it and say, what are the pieces I'm taking out of these different experiences, and how am I putting them together to get me to, you know, I want to work at the public defender's office.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's usually not that hard to become a member of the board of a certain club. You know, it's like you don't have to do that much to be the vice president of whatever is a 1L or 2L. I think also, you know, looking at your background in a different light. So maybe you don't have some of those checkbox things because you took time off for family reasons, for example. Well, you weren't just sitting around. You know, what skills did you develop through this experience? Did it make you a more empathetic person? Did you become more organized because you had twins? You know, whatever this is, sometimes people think like, oh, I can't mention any of this. This is probably more for like an interview type scenario. But, you know, they think like, oh, I can't mention any of this. But I think you can if you make it part of that story of, you know, I took this time off, but like, here's what I did. And I, you know, joined volunteer groups and I joined the board of this organization and I made connections and whatever. I mean, not that you had to do that, but you know, you probably weren't just sitting around.
I also think that employers are not looking for one specific person. And I think that some law students think that.
Right.
Like, I need to be this person. That's what they want. And I just don't think that's true. And different law firms have personalities and other jobs have personalities. And I think that they usually want a mix of people who want to be there, you know, and who can do the job. So I think rather than like hide things, like you were saying, you know, that you may not think are relevant, find a way to make it relevant.
Yeah, because you want to...
There always is.
Yeah, and you want to be able to show up to this position as like a whole person. Yeah. Because that's the way that you're going to be happy in this job and succeed. And, you know, maybe you can find a job where you're not going to be able to show up like that, but you're probably not going to really be that successful because you're not going to be comfortable.
Well, and I'll say on the employer side, if I were looking at a resume, I wouldn't necessarily just want someone who went to a really good undergrad, majored in political science.
Econ.
You know, yeah. Maybe worked for like 1 year.
As a paralegal.
You know, exactly. And then applied to law school, you know, did really well on the LSAT, went to school, did these exact things. That's not necessarily what employers are looking for.
Well, you might want one of those people.
I mean, yeah, exactly.
You can put one or two of those people in a summer class, but you don't want to fill your summer class with 20 people who that's what they did, because you're not getting a diversity of perspectives at that point. Yeah. And I think
there's room for lots of people.
Yeah. And I also think you can ask a friend. You mentioned having people look at your resume and everything too, but you can also just sort of ask them like, what traits do you think I have that like would be valuable for an employer? Because they're probably going to point out things that you maybe didn't think of, or at least they're going to be nicer than you probably are to yourself.
True. Or if you've had another job, maybe you can go back and look at like a review you had. If there's some good things, or if you're still friendly with people you worked with, like hear what they have to say. They think that that your good qualities are things you excelled in, because I'm sure some of those things are going to be relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, before we wrap up, I think it's important to remember some of the gendered aspects of this. So for example, women have a tendency to underplay their accomplishments, and they also typically apply only for jobs that they feel 100% qualified for. So for all the women listening to this, please don't do that. Be aware there are other people out there, they are applying with full confidence and they are only 60%, maybe 70% qualified. You are more than qualified to apply for any job that you want to apply for. I'm not saying you'll get it, but just apply.
Yeah, I think that there's really nothing to lose for applying, you know? And that's what I always tell people, especially if there's a certain area you want, why not cast a wide net?
Right. I mean, you don't want to only apply for jobs that you think you're a stretch for, but if there are jobs where you feel like, I have like 80% of the things they're looking for, but maybe I don't have like these one or two things, just apply, because no one is really going to care.
Yeah, and I also think something to keep in mind is you may not get the job you think you're 100% qualified for.
There's no guarantee.
That happens all the time.
Yeah, they might think you're overqualified.
Exactly. I think that happens a lot. So I think that, you never know. There could be someone who's like, oh, this is kind of a different candidate than everyone else.
I want to talk to them.
Yeah. So I agree that that's definitely an issue between genders.
Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
My final thoughts are, well, what I always say, which is make sure there's no mistakes on any of the material. So
if you want to immediately sing your story, have a lot of typos.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to that, which is that no one's even going to look at your story.
Well, the story is going to be this person is not detail oriented.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the story you tell with typos.
That says a lot. And that's on anything you're submitting to them. So that means your resume, your cover letter, like an email that you wrote.
Writing sample.
Things like that, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, because that is really one of those areas where you might be the most qualified candidate, but if you submit materials full of typos to a law firm or a lawyer or anyone, they're going to be like, I wouldn't trust this person. I wouldn't put my name on this. No way. So you've got to be careful.
Absolutely.
All right, well, Sadie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. With that, we are unfortunately out of time. If you'd like more career help or the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, you can check out careerdicta.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.